Hello, I'm Dr. Christina Reese, and today I want to talk to you about generational trauma. How trauma impacts several generations in a family or in a community. But first, we need to define trauma. How do we identify trauma? How do we know what it is? So, trauma, very simply, is anything that causes you to fear for your life, that takes away your feelings of safety and security. When that happens, it could be as a result of a natural disaster, witnessing violence, a medical trauma, abuse or neglect, or just being raised in an environment that doesn't feel safe. So that's what trauma is. Now, what does trauma do? Trauma does a couple of things in our bodies. It causes biological responses that are not just emotional reactions. Now, of course, if you feel afraid for your life or your feelings of safety and security have been removed from you, you're going to have some emotions about that. You're most likely going to have really big feelings of anger, really big feelings of sadness, really big feelings of fear. Now, it's important to recognize that anger is a secondary emotion. It comes after fear or sadness. Now, when we have these really big emotions about the things that have happened to us in our life, well, we have to learn emotion regulation to know what to do with them. I'm going to talk about emotion regulation in a different video, so look for that one in the list of videos below. Now, when we have something traumatic happen in our life, we have an emotional reaction, but we also have a biological reaction. And that's what we're going to talk about today in relation to generational trauma. So when we have that traumatic event happen in our life, our feelings of safety and security have been taken from us. And that creates a biological response. Our body reacts. First of all, we all have an alert system in our brain that is on the lookout for things that are not safe, that are not secure. It is responsible to keep us safe. And so when that alert system goes off, we pay attention to it because it's letting us know that something bad is getting ready to happen or something bad is happening to us right now. When that alert system goes off in our brain, it does two things. It releases two survival hormones. The first is something called cortisol. Cortisol is released from our pituitary gland, and it heads to our brain, and it shuts down functions that it does not necessarily feel like are needed for survival. Because really, that alert system that is trying to keep you safe and keep you alive is only interested in that moment in keeping you safe and keeping you alive. So when that cortisol heads to your brain, it can make it difficult to think through things. It can make it difficult to problem solve. It can make it difficult to remember things. And it can also make it difficult to listen and concentrate. So when that cortisol is headed to our brain, it's really going to be impacting the decisions that we make, how we're able to think through things, the way we're able to see the world around us. Now, the second survival hormone that is released is adrenaline. So when that alert system goes off and it sends the message to the pituitary gland to release the cortisol, it also sends a message to the adrenal gland to release adrenaline. Now, adrenaline floods our body, and adrenaline does a couple of things inside of our body. First of all, it speeds up our heart rate, which raises our blood pressure. It constricts our lungs and can make it difficult to breathe. It tightens our muscles so that we might end up with a headache or a stomach ache. It can give us energy and make us need to move our bodies, make us kind of wiggly. When that adrenaline is coursing through our body, well, we have to get rid of it in some way. And the best way to get rid of it is by doing some physical activity. So any kind of body movement. It could be going for a walk or going for a run. It could be doing some jumping jacks or some sit-ups. It could be doing some yoga poses. Any kind of physical activity is going to help to burn the adrenaline and to therefore rebalance what's happening inside of your body. Bring your heartbeat back down to baseline. Bring your breathing to baseline. Bring your blood pressure to baseline. So one of the best things that we can do when we've experienced a trauma is to get moving and do some kind of physical activity with our body. Let's come back to the cortisol for a minute. What do we do with all that cortisol that's coursing through us or coursing through our brain? Drinking lots of water to flush it out is a really great way to bring balance back to your brain. Eating nutritious foods is another way to metabolize that cortisol. And finally, getting good sleep. Good sleep will help your brain to recover when it has been flooded with that cortisol. So good sleep for adults is 8 hours of sleep a night. For children, 10 to 12 hours of sleep a night. That's what they need, especially if they've experienced some trauma and are having lots of cortisol in their brains. So this is how our body reacts when we have experienced a trauma, when we have experienced a situation where our life was at risk or felt like it was at risk, when our feelings of safety and security have been taken from us. Now, that alert system can become a little overactive. It can start to be what we call hypervigilant, meaning that it's always on alert because it's always looking for things that might not be safe or things that might harm us. And what that means is when it's on high alert all the time is that sometimes it misfires and it goes off even when we're safe, when we're okay. We still don't feel safe. So it is constantly firing, which means that the cortisol and the adrenaline are always at play. Let's come back to our generational trauma and the impact that this has on families and communities. So if this is how our body responds when we've experienced something traumatic, when we look at generations of people, when we look at, for instance, the people group of our Jewish community, for instance, who survived the Holocaust, and they experienced a situation where their lives were in danger and were threatened, and they had very high anxiety, very high cortisol and adrenaline levels at that time. When we look at other people groups, when we look at our Native American people groups who had their lives put in danger, where they feared for their life and had to protect their lives, had to fight for their lives, again, feelings of safety and security being removed. Those biological responses at that time, in that generation, many, 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 many years ago, those individuals, our family members, our ancestors, experienced this trauma and this stress. However, as their bodies were responding, as the cortisol and the adrenaline were being released, then when we come to, generational impact, when that generation had children, what happens during a pregnancy that a biological mother will pass to her child some hormones while the baby is growing and developing. For instance, if mother is experiencing stress during her pregnancy, if mother is anxious, then mother will have high cortisol levels and high adrenaline levels coursing through her, which are then also going to be impacting her child. And if those high cortisol and high adrenaline levels are present while the brain is being developed, while the nervous system of that baby is being developed, then those things can be almost hardwired in to that baby's development. Now that child is born, and that child experiences higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of distress. Their alert system may be more hypervigilant than another child's. And as that child grows, if they are experiencing this and are not having any interventions that are helping them to manage it, then we will see that as that child matures and grows into adulthood and goes on to have their own children, that this cycle can repeat itself down through generations. So we will see anxiety start to follow in family lines. We can see depression start to follow in family lines as well when we have a first generation that has experienced a trauma and is experiencing overwhelming sadness, overwhelming distress at the loss of life or the loss of a way of life, and persecution. That will impact a person's emotions, which can then impact their biology. So again, we see how through the generations this is then passed down. And now we are 4 or 5 generations later, sometimes many more. And we are still impacted by the trauma of the generations that went before us. So what can we do to stop that cycle? What can we do to slow that developing? What I just talked about, finding ways biologically to change the chemistry inside of your body by making sure that you are increasing your activity levels to burn that adrenaline, and by making sure that you have good hydration, good nutrition, and good sleep to clear out that cortisol that is collecting in the brain. That is going to help to bring some relief. These are simple things that we can start doing now that will help us to find the balance that we need when we are coming from families and communities where there may have been trauma in past generations or trauma continuing through generations in our lives.